Okay, let's have a think about how the government reacted to the outbreak of war in 1914. The war itself saw a huge enlargement and extension of the government's role in people's lives during the First World War, and this would happen again in the Second World War. What you must remember, of course, is that the government, very, very early on in the war in 1914, passes something called the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, the Defence of the Realm Act, which gives them enormous enlarged powers to do many significant things during the First World War. And this included changing or introducing British summertime. They controlled the consumption of alcohol. They were afraid that munitions workers, for example, would get drunk at certain times of the day, so they narrowed the amount of time you could go to a pub, and that would last till relatively recently. They appointed special constables. They outlawed strikes in certain industries, so that the vital industries to the war effort would not be impeded by strike action. And they made certain occupations reserved occupations, primarily the mining industry, the steel making industry. These people who were employed in these industries were not allowed to leave their jobs. So DORA is incredibly important. It enlarges and extends the role of government in ordinary people's lives, and it bans and censors anything that the government doesn't want spoken about the war. Also, very importantly, in 1916, it passes conscription, or it makes conscription compulsory. We know for the first 2 years of the First World War, Britain, alone amongst the countries that were fighting, was a volunteer army. Thousands, in fact millions of British people had joined the army in the First World War without being compelled to do so. They were encouraged to do so through government propaganda, and in some cases this was very heavy-handed, but by and large they were free to join the army if they saw fit. By the middle of 1915, the end of 1915, going into 1916, this was no longer tenable. There were not sufficient recruits coming through to replace those soldiers injured and wounded in the fighting. So the government had to pass a law which would make conscription into the army compulsory, and this was the Military Service Act of 1916. And this allowed for only 4 types of people to be allowed exemption from joining the army. And I'm looking at the book to remind myself, the 4 categories of people who didn't have to join were those in reserved occupations, as I said before, like miners, people who were physically unfit or are unwell, people who had family responsibilities, who were looking after children perhaps without a mother in the family, and lastly, significantly for us, conscientious objectors. And you should know your conscientious objectors very well. Around roughly 16,000 people applied to be conscientious objectors, and they had to prove to a military tribunal that their excuses or their reasons had some validity, that on moral grounds or ethical grounds or religious grounds they were not prepared to fight for their country. And they had to prove their case to this military tribunal, on which sat a member of the armed forces, as the name would suggest, and 2 professional people, lawyers, judges. And on the whole, these tribunals were not particularly sympathetic to the arguments or the claims of the people trying to get exemption from fighting. They fell into 2 categories: the absolutists, who would refuse to have anything to do with the war whatsoever, or the alternativists, who were prepared to do some activities as long as they involved no participation in the actual fighting. On the whole, conches, as they were derogatorily called, were treated abysmally. They were sent to prison, they were made to do hard labour, they were brutalised, they were bullied, they were treated very, very badly. In fact, I think 10 died in prison. Several died after the end of the war when they were released from prison, and quite a few apparently went insane under the pressure of their under their treatment during the First World War. Is this repeated in the Second World War? Well, there is, when war breaks out in 1939, there is a law passed, very similar to the DORA law, Defence of the Realm Act. This time it's called the Emergency Powers Act, 1940. And again, conscription is introduced not midway through the war, but from the very beginning. And again, there's this allowance or this exemption for people who claim conscience. However, their treatment is very significantly different from the way the conchis or the COs are treated in the First World War. We know, if you remember, we discussed it in class, that even the Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, put it on record that these people should be treated with great courtesy and with sensitivity, and they should be allowed to profess their objection to the war, and there's no stigma involved against that. So that set the tone, if you like. Also, the military tribunal lost the soldier or the military component of the tribunal, and again this broadened the scope of the people who were adjudicating on the validity of these people's claims. So the system was much fairer, less brutal, less harsh, less prescriptive, if you like. However, the government in the Second World War, like its counterpart in the First World War, will become much more enlarged and will have a finger in every aspect of British life during the period of the war. It's a total war where the civilian population has to do their bit as much as the soldier fighting on the front line. So bear that in mind, that the government's role in both wars increases enormously, and it passes several laws to make sure that people aren't saying the wrong thing, people aren't put in a position where they can release information that may be of help to the enemy. People are compelled to join the army, people are compelled to join services in the UK that aid the war effort. First World War and the Second World War are true instances of total war, where every single person, not just the soldier who's doing the fighting, is actively involved in the pursuit of the war.